How you doing, everyone? Welcome to this lecture for exercise physiology. Today we are going to talk about hypertrophy. So we're going to continue our theme of muscle structure and function, and we are going to do a kind of short overview to hypertrophy today, and we'll follow that up with the subsequent lecture that goes into a little bit more depth on hypertrophy next. So before we talk about hypertrophy, let's talk a little bit about atrophy. So, muscle atrophy is a decrease in muscle strength due to a decrease in muscle mass or in the amount of muscle fibers. Atrophy can be partial or incomplete and can vary in the extent of muscle weakness that a person experiences. Muscle atrophy is often a result of diseases such as cancer, AIDS, congestive heart failure, COPD, renal failure, or if someone gets severely burned. So you've got medical conditions that can result in atrophy. Starvation or severely limiting your energy or caloric intake can also result in muscle atrophy. Finally, simple disuse of a muscle, either due to a sedentary lifestyle or because of bed rest, can also result in muscle atrophy. So it's when we've got a decrease in muscle strength due to a decrease in muscle mass. I say at the top there, hypertrophy Hollywood style. This is kind of atrophy Hollywood style. In the photograph we have Christian Bale, who's well known for undergoing very dramatic physical transformations in order to prepare for the various roles that he takes on. In The Machinist back in 2004, he underwent severe atrophy. He got down to 124 pounds, according to the website that I looked him up on, which is about 56 kilos. So that is very, very light. He does not. He looks very atrophied there in that role. This is in contrast to subsequent roles that he took on, where he gained a lot of weight, which we'll look at in a second. Specific type of atrophy that you guys should also be aware of is atrophy over time that is due to aging. That's a condition known as sarcopenia. So sarcopenia is specifically atrophy that has occurred over time due to aging. So as we age, we will on average, most people will lose a certain amount of muscle mass year on year, decade on decade, as they grow older. This can be exacerbated if, as the person ages, they become more and more sedentary. But generally speaking, as we age, the average person in the population will gradually lose muscle mass as they age. And this process, muscle atrophy, which is a decrease in muscle strength due to a decrease in muscle mass that occurs over time due to aging, is known as sarcopenia. Okay, so what we're going to focus on today then is hypertrophy. Hypertrophy is the opposite of atrophy. It's an increase in the size of a muscle through an increase in the size of its component cells. So we've looked at depth in detail at what the component cells are of a muscle. You guys have had plenty of time to hear me talking about muscle structure up until now. So when we're talking about hypertrophy, we are talking about an overall increase in the size of a muscle due to an increase in the size of its component cells. And in the second picture here, we have our Hollywood style hypertrophy, where Christian Bale is playing the role of Batman, or in Batman Begins, a year later. So The Machinist was released in 2004. That doesn't necessarily mean he was filming it in 2004. And Batman Begins, obviously released in 2005, doesn't necessarily mean he was filming in 2005. But from one movie to the next, he went from 124 pounds up to 185 pounds, or in metric, that's 56 kilos up to 84 kilos. So depending on what you consider his starting point, he either gained a significant amount of weight or he lost a significant amount of weight. But either way, he did undergo a very, very dramatic transformation there from one to the other. So that's just a nice illustration of atrophy versus hypertrophy. Hypertrophy occurs quite rapidly during puberty in males. It occurs at an increased rate. Natural hypertrophy normally stops at full growth when we reach late teens or early adulthood. An adequate supply of amino acids, or the component parts of our protein intake, is essential to produce muscle hypertrophy. Also essential to muscle hypertrophy is testosterone, one of the body's major growth hormones. On average, men find hypertrophy much easier to achieve than women because they've got much higher amounts of testosterone in their body. If a person takes additional testosterone, such as if they take anabolic steroids, this will increase natural hypertrophy. It is also considered to be performance enhancing, obviously, and the use of this could result in competitors being suspended or banned from competitions if its use is detected. Someone's after opening my door here. One sec. Sorry, one of the kids came in. So where were we there? Saying, yes, sorry. Testosterone causes hypertrophy, and that's one of the reasons why men or boys, when they go through puberty, will experience significant gains in muscle mass because they'll have a greater increase in their testosterone levels compared to females. So this is one of the... testosterone is an androgen, a male-making hormone, and obviously at puberty, males will experience a surge in their androgen levels, their testosterone levels will increase, and that's where they'll go through a natural growth spurt, which will include laying down of a significant amount of muscle. Then as we go through the rest of later life, because males tend to have higher levels of testosterone in their body, they will generally find it easier to build muscle to experience hypertrophy compared to females. But that's not to say that females can't build muscle. It will just occur at a slower rate, and it won't they won't achieve as high amounts of muscle mass as a male. Okay, generally speaking, the bigger a person is, the stronger they are going to be. And this is demonstrated by the correlation between body weight and world records set in Olympic weightlifting. So what we're looking at here, if we see, we've got the weight class on the bottom, and we've got the total lifted for the snatch, for the clean and jerk, and then the total, which is the combined score for the snatch and the clean and jerk. And we see quite clearly a linear relationship there, that as body weight increases, so does the amount of weight that is lifted. So the bigger, heavier person is going to be stronger, and we see that generally the men end up being bigger and heavier than the females, and they end up lifting higher amounts of weight. Even at comparable body weights, the men will be stronger because of other relative differences in the males and females there. But this generalization, of course, is based on the assumption that the person who's bigger is bigger because they've got increased levels of lean muscle mass as opposed to fat mass. So if a bigger person who's carrying more muscle is going to be a stronger person. And this relates back then to the amount of force that can be produced by a muscle. As we've said in our previous lectures, this is directly linked to the amount of actin and myosin within the muscle fibers, these component parts of the muscle fibers. The more actin and myosin there is, the more actin and myosin cross bridges that can be formed. The more cross bridges that are formed, the more power strokes that can occur, and therefore the more force that muscle can produce. So this simple principle explains why larger muscles containing more actin and myosin generate more force than smaller muscles. It's fairly straightforward and obvious. In response to resistance training, skeletal muscles can increase their size by increasing the size of existing muscle fibers. That's called hypertrophy. Or they can increase the total number of fibers that are in the muscle. That's known as hyperplasia. So we'll have a look at those independently now in a second. We'll start with hyperplasia. Hyperplasia is an increase in the total number of muscle fibers within a specific muscle. So if you remember back when we were looking at the structure of muscle, we looked at the muscle, and then we looked at the bundle of muscle fibers, which were made, obviously, the fascicle, which was a bundle of muscle fibers, and then the individual muscle fibers were made up of actin and myosin myofilaments. So hyperplasia is when there is an increase in the total number of muscle fibers within the specific muscle. This is a chronic adaptation to training, and it has been proven to occur in fat cells. So in humans, fat cells can multiply in number, and they can enlarge when they are with overfeeding. So if we overeat, the number of adipocytes, that is the proper name for a fat cell, will enlarge. And that number stays constant until they reach a critical size. And once that adipocyte reaches a certain critical size, the new fat cells will be made, hyperplasia. There'll be an increase in the number of fat cells, and the individual will continue to gain weight as those new fat cells store more fat and enlarge until they multiply in size, and this will keep progressing until the person continues on through overweight, obesity, and on into morbid obesity. So this happens in humans. We can see hyperplasia occurring in fat cells, an increase in the total number of fat cells in the body. Hyperplasia in the muscle cells requires is based on the principle that the muscle cell can split into two, and one individual muscle cell will become two muscle cells, and then we'll have more of the total number of muscle fibers within the overall muscle. Now, if we look, there's been a study that has looked at this. So back in 1980, there was a paper that reported that resistance training in cats significantly increased both the muscle fiber size and the number of individual muscle fibers. This study always stands out in my mind because it is so unusual. The researchers trained the cats to use a paw flicking to push food in order to get fed. So what cats had to do was they had to push on a lever or flick the lever with their paw, and when they did that, food was released from the feeder into the food bowl. And they introduced a progressive resistance training protocol for the cats by steadily increasing the amount of weight or resistance that was placed on the lever. So the cat had to use more and more force to flick the lever, to move the lever in order to release the food. So they were following a progressive resistance training specifically for cats. So it stands out in my mind for those reasons. One of the major criticisms of this paper was that the cross-sectional area used for the pre and post exercise muscle fibers may not have been true representations of the entire muscle. So what we're seeing here in this diagram here is we've got a single muscle fiber, and depending on where you take the level of the cross-section of the muscle, we can see that it might appear as one, or if hyperplasia occurs, it might split into two at some point. It'll start to separate and split. So depending on where you take the cross-section of the muscle, you may incorrectly interpret whether the muscle had split or whether it had not split. So the experiment was repeated, and what they did instead was they removed sections of muscle and they counted the number of fibers that were there, rather than just looking at a cross-section of the muscle and counting what was visible in the cross-section. They took a whole section of muscle and separated out the individual muscle fibers and counted how many individual muscle fibers that were there. So from the results there, it appears definitive that that hyperplasia can occur in skeletal muscle. It did say that this was from a form of ballistic training, which is not normal resistance training. The cat had to use a flicking type of movement, not the more slow and controlled concentric and eccentric contraction that we would normally do. But this is one of the papers that's put forward, one of the first papers that was put forward to suggest that hyperplasia, the increase in the individual number of muscle fibers, can occur in skeletal muscle. Obviously it was done in cats, and cats are not humans, so we wanted to see what people were obviously interested to know whether hyperplasia can occur in humans. Now, there have been a couple of studies for it with evidence for and against hyperplasia occurring in humans, and generally speaking, some of these studies were done in bodybuilders. So again, studying bodybuilders is problematic because they are generally not natural. There's some extra stuff going on there. But from the papers that were done, there's some evidence in support of hyperplasia in humans. There's some evidence against hyperplasia occurring in humans. None of the studies on the previous page took the potential for genetic differences into account, and they only measured post-training fiber sizes. Okay, so they didn't have any pre-measures to compare to. They only looked at post measures, and they made inferences based on those results. Work with human cadaver studies, with dead bodies, has shown that muscle fiber number can vary very, very greatly from individual to individual. So therefore, the enhanced muscle size of the elite athletes reported in the papers there in the bodybuilders could have been due to a greater number of muscle fibers in these subjects from birth, and not because they had an increased number of muscle fibers due to the training that they undertook. It could be simply that they had a high number of muscle fibers from birth, and that notion is supported from cadaver studies, which shows that the number of individual muscle fibers varies greatly from person to person. The conclusion of some of these papers is that hyperplasia is physiologically possible. Okay, so it can occur. However, current evidence suggests that the significant proportion, 90 to 95% of any increases in muscle size following resistance training occurs due to an increase in the muscle fiber size. So that's hypertrophy and not hyperplasia. So in humans, hyperplasia is physiologically possible, but as it stands, the evidence is inconclusive as to whether it possibly occurs or not. And regardless of whether it occurs or not, if someone's muscles do increase in size, the majority of that muscle size is going to come from hypertrophy, not hyperplasia. Okay, so let's get on to hypertrophy then. Hypertrophy is when there's an increase in the size of the existing muscle fibers. It is not an increase in the number of muscle fibers or the creation of new muscle fibers that hyperplasia suggests. Hypertrophy is an increase in the size of the existing muscle fibers. There are two types of hypertrophy. We've got transient and chronic. Transient is when there's an increase in muscle size immediately following a workout, more commonly known as the pump. And that's, you if you go into a gym and you do like a bodybuilding type program, if you do any exercise at all, even cycling on a bike, you'll feel a pump in your muscles, and the muscles themselves will have increased in size. This is a transient, short-term increase in muscle size immediately following a workout. Then if we have transient, then obviously we can have chronic. Chronic hypertrophy is an actual increase in the muscle size following long-term resistance training, and that's what we're really interested in. But let's have a quick look at the explanation for transient hypertrophy first. As we said, it's an acute change in muscle size, so it occurs in the short term, and it's mainly due to fluid accumulation in the intracellular and interstitial space. It does not reflect structural change in the muscle. So what we have here on the page here is a muscle fiber, and we're saying that in this muscle fiber there's 4 myofibrils, and at rest this is the size of it. Transient hypertrophy, also known as sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, is when the muscle increases in size acutely, so in the short term, due to a change in the amount of fluid that is in the intracellular and interstitial space. So in and around the muscle fibers themselves, there will be an ingress of fluid. That fluid will cause the muscle to swell up in size. So there is an actual increase in size in the muscle, but it's only transient. After that fluid accumulation dissipates and things go back down to normal, the muscle will return to its original resting state. So we go from a resting state up to an increased size, but no change in the fibers inside. Okay, myofibrillar hypertrophy then is a chronic training-induced increase in the muscle fiber size. It's a gradual process that only occurs following months to years of resistance training. And it's more evident in type 2 muscle fibers. So we've said that current evidence indicates that 90 to 95% of any increase in muscle size following resistance training is mainly due to hypertrophy, and specifically we're talking about myofibrillar hypertrophy. So, although, as we said there, although resistance training increases both the size of type 1 and type 2 fibers, weight training will elicit a much greater degree of hypertrophy in type 2 fibers. This is physiologically significant because type 2 fibers generate greater force than type 1 fibers. The mechanisms to explain why these type 2 fibers are more prone to hypertrophy remains unclear at the moment, and additional research is needed to establish the answer to this question. So what happens when we undergo resistance training? So what we see an increase in the fiber cross-sectional area, and that results from an increase in the number of myofibrillar proteins. So we're talking about the actin and myosin filaments, or the individual actin and myosin proteins that we see an increase in those. This increase in the actin and myosin filaments in the fiber occurs because of the addition of sarcomeres in parallel to the existing sarcomeres that are there, which results in muscle fiber hypertrophy. The addition, so on the previous slide there, so what we're seeing here, we're looking inside this individual muscle fiber here, and this is representative of our individual actin and myosin filaments. So here we've got the increase in size due to changes in fluid, no change in the number of actin and myosin filaments. Here the muscle has got bigger, it's increased to the same size here, but this time the size change, or the increase in size, is due to increases in the number of these myofilaments, so the actin and myosin filaments in parallel, so they are added to the sides of the ones that are there already. Okay, they are parallel to those existing myofilaments, and that is myofibrillar hypertrophy, a chronic training-induced increase in the muscle fiber size, and it is due to the addition of actin and myosin filaments, or addition of sarcomeres in parallel to the existing sarcomeres in the muscle. When we have an increase in the number of myofibrillar proteins, so the actin and myosin filaments, we're going to have more actin and myosin cross bridges that occur, and therefore when there's an increase in the size of the muscle, thanks to the addition of these sarcomeres in series, we're going to get a muscle that is able to produce more force and therefore be a stronger and more powerful muscle. Okay, just coming to the end now. So how does this occur? What's the process, or how do we experience how does this hypertrophy results? Well, an increase in this, what happens is there's an increase in muscle protein synthesis, and that's stimulated by resistance training. This appears to be the primary mechanism which is responsible for myofibrillar hypertrophy in trained individuals. Any resistance training program that induces the stimulation of protein synthesis is going to increase the level of testosterone and growth hormone in the person. As we said back at the start, testosterone is the androgen, one of the growth hormones that promotes one of the hormones that promotes the release of growth hormone, another specific hormone, from the pituitary gland, and this interacts to further increase muscle protein synthesis. So the training is the stimulus, which is going to increase muscle protein synthesis, which results in hypertrophy. Increased muscle protein synthesis also increases our testosterone levels. If we increase our testosterone levels, we'll get an increase in growth hormone levels. And then if we get an increase in growth hormone levels, we get an increase in other things like insulin-like growth factor, IGF-1, and insulin-like growth factor 2, which also stimulate muscle growth. IGF-1 and 2 have direct effects on satellite cells. You might remember that we very briefly mentioned satellite cells when we were talking about muscle structure. They're going to come back into play now in the next lecture. This is a fairly complex process with a lot of players going on here. But what we're going to do now in the next, we'll leave it there for today. In the next lecture, we'll start to take a deeper dive into that process of muscle protein synthesis and how hypertrophy occurs. So, some quick summary of today, what we discussed. We discussed the difference between atrophy and hypertrophy. We specifically named sarcopenia and identified what that was. We looked at hyperplasia versus myofibular hypertrophy. We concluded that hyperplasia is physiologically possible, but that is unlikely to contribute significantly to muscle growth in humans. Then we looked at hypertrophy itself, and we said that there was transient hypertrophy, an acute short-term change in muscle size due to changes in the amount of fluid in the muscle, and that is contrasted by chronic hypertrophy, which is an actual change in the number of myofilaments that are in the muscle. So it's an actual structural change, an increase in size due to structural changes in the muscle, known as myofibular hypertrophy, because we're increasing the number of myofibular proteins, actin and myosin, that are in the muscle. Okay, let's park it there for today. Thank you very much for your attention. We'll pick it up in lecture 2 on hypertrophy, where we'll look at the process in more detail.